The topic which I would be speaking on is neoliberalism at a dead end. Now, to see why neoliberalism is at a dead end, it's very important to see what exactly neoliberalism is. Neoliberalism or neoliberal policy regime is actually a policy which is associated with countries that have opted for globalization. And globalization basically meaning freer flows of commodities and capital, including finance, across country borders. Now, this wasn't always the case. It wasn't the case, for instance, under the earlier international regime that was the Bretton Woods system, which was set up during the Second World War and which ended in 1973. Under the Bretton Woods system, countries imposed heavy tariffs against, or were free to impose heavy tariffs against imports of commodities. And of course, they also had capital control, so that capital was not free to move across country borders. Even when productive investment was encouraged to come into the country, which has been the case for a very long time, it was allowed to come to particular areas in particular circumstances under particular conditions. And sometimes it came, sometimes it did not. But this idea of relatively freer flows of commodities and capital across country borders is associated with the current regime of globalization, and the policies that go together with this regime of globalization is what we call neoliberal policies. These neoliberal policies have a number of very important implications, which follow from the fact that the most important aspect of contemporary globalization is the globalization of financial flows. Now, financial flows, for instance, it's very difficult to say. It's not just that capital flows are free across countries, but even financial flows are free across countries. Because it's very difficult to have restrictions on finance but openness to capital flows. It goes together, and therefore what you have is financial flows also being free across countries. You have a huge amount of finance moving around the world at very short notice. It is in country A today, it moves to country B tomorrow, or even at 5 minutes notice, and so on. So finance moves around very easily through telephone calls across country borders. Now, if you have financial flows across borders, which can actually move out of the country at a moment's notice, this has very important implications. Therefore, I'd like to discuss some of the implications of globalization, of which, as I mentioned, globalization of finance is a very important component. The first implication is that we have governments that actually are governments belonging to nation states. We have an Indian government because we have an Indian state. We have a Pakistani government because there's a Pakistani state. We have a British government, which is the executive part of the British state, and so on. So we live in a world of nation states. The US, Canada, Britain, Pakistan, Poland, India, China, these are all nations. Each of them has a state. Therefore, we're in a world of nation states, and in each of these nation states, there is a government. Now, imagine if you have a nation state, but you have globalization of finance. So finance is international. Finance can move out of the country, but the state is a nation state. Suppose the nation state or the government of the nation state pursues a set of policies which finance does not like, okay, which finance is hostile to. Then finance would just move out of that country in vast quantities. Suddenly you may have billions of rupees flowing out of India because the Indian government has done something which finance capital does not like. Therefore, if you have globalization of finance, and if finance does move out, then of course it is going to give rise to a kind of real financial crisis in the country. You would not have enough money to let finance move out suddenly like that. You wouldn't have enough foreign exchange. Therefore, if you have a nation state and if you have globalization of finance, a nation state inserted within a world of globalization of finance, then the nation state, willy-nilly, whether it likes it or not, has to pursue policies which actually finance capital likes. Now, notice what it means for democracy. Democracy means that there are a whole lot of alternative governments with alternative programs and policies. Therefore, the electorate chooses between one or the other, and therefore the electorate is sovereign in a democracy. People are the sovereignty of the people, is the hallmark of democracy. But on the other hand, if that country is part of globalization of finance, then what happens is that no matter who the people choose, the government that comes to power has to pursue policies which finance likes. Therefore, all the governments are more or less forced to pursue very similar kinds of policies. And therefore, instead of the sovereignty of the people, you have the sovereignty of finance capital. And this is a very important hallmark of the regime of contemporary globalization. Contemporary globalization, therefore, abrogates the sovereignty of the people and in its place substitutes the sovereignty of finance capital, which itself is globalized. All countries more or less pursue very similar policies, and all the different political formations are more or less pursuing same policies liked by or dictated by finance, unless they actually have the courage to move out of this regime of globalization. You would have known, for instance, that in Greece, Syriza, which was a left-wing government, came to power on the promise that they are actually going to pursue very different policies from all previous governments. But when Syriza came to power, Syriza was more or less forced to pursue the same policies because Syriza did not opt out of this regime of globalization of finance. Therefore, the fact of having a world of nation states within a world of globalization of finance or a regime of globalization of finance is a very serious abrogation of democracy. People don't often realize it, but I would like to put it before you. The second important feature of this world of globalization is that, let's see, capital now is moving across the globe. You have US multinationals who are investing in China. You have US multinational investing in India, in Sri Lanka, in Indonesia, in Bangladesh, and so on. Therefore, multinational capital, metropolitan capital, is moving out to locate plants in countries with with lower wages, with cheaper labor power. Now, therefore, workers in the advanced countries are now having to compete against workers in the underdeveloped countries. Wages are much lower here. They can't go on strike in the advanced countries demanding higher wages because then capital would say, all right, you want higher wages, I'm going to give you higher wages. I shall locate my plant in Indonesia. Therefore, you find that now the workers in the advanced countries are really competing against the workers in the third world countries who, because of the vast labor reserves created under colonialism in these countries, have a more or less subsistence level of wages. You have huge labor reserves, huge unemployment in the third world countries, because of which the wages are more or less at a subsistence level. Now the advanced country workers have to more or less feel the effect of these third world labor reserves on their wage demands. Because of which, what you find is that taking the world as a whole, the real wage vector of the world as a whole, the real wages, I'm not saying they get equalized, but the real wages across the world do not really go up over time. Okay? Because on the one hand, the advanced country workers' real wages don't go up because the third world has these labor reserves and capital is mobile. The third world real wages don't go up because the third world labor reserves don't get exhausted, even though capital comes from the advanced countries to this place. In other words, even in countries with very high rates of growth, like India before the recent crisis, India had 7%, 8% rate of growth, but the labor reserves never got used up because the rate of growth of employment was really much lower, was just a fraction, was even lower than the rate of population growth, because of which you had the labor reserves not getting exhausted. So you have a situation where labor reserves, the vector of real wages don't go up because the whole world is now subject to the, the effects of third world labor reserve. Workers everywhere are subject to the effects of third world labor reserve. But labor productivity everywhere has gone up. So if wages don't go up, but labor productivity goes up, then that means the share of wages, the share of working people's income in total world output goes down. The share of surplus goes up. And this is the reason for a vast increase in inequality all across the world, which people like Piketty and so on have been talking about. They keep talking about the massive increase in inequality that has taken place in the world, in individual countries and taking the world as a whole. The reason behind that massive increase in inequality is something they don't analyze or discuss, but that lies in the fact of globalization, which exposes entire working class of the world to the baneful, harmful consequences of the third world labor reserves. Now, there's a third implication apart from the increase in income inequalities. Because of this increase in income inequalities, that is of great importance. And that is that suppose you find that you shift a rupee from a working man and give it to the capitalist. The working man may be consuming more or less the entire rupee. If you take the rupee out of the working man, the consumption goes down by the entire rupee. You give the rupee to the capitalist may in fact consume half a rupee immediately, put the rest in his pockets to be consumed later or to be used later. Therefore, the proportion of consumption out of income is much higher for the working people than for the capitalists and their hangers on, those who live off the surplus. Therefore, this reduction in the share of wages, rise in the share of surplus in the world output, basically means that there is an overall reduction of demand in the world economy. For any given investment in a given period, consumption goes down because of this shift from wages to surplus, and that implies with the reduced aggregate demand, reduced output and employment, because of which investment also goes down, and therefore you have a tendency towards what Marx had called an overproduction crisis. So the increase in income inequality, the rise in the share of economic surplus in output produces a tendency towards overproduction. This tendency towards overproduction could be, and here I come to the last effect of globalization, this tendency towards overproduction could be controlled through state intervention. We know that in the post-Second World War period, states everywhere pursued policies of what are called demand management. That if ever there was an unemployment, government expenditure would increase. And if government expenditure increased, then the overall level of demand would increase. Therefore, employment would increase, output would increase. Therefore, state intervention in managing demand to keep employment at a high level is what had characterized the world economy in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. But now, with globalization, I said that the capacity of the nation state to do what it likes is capacity that is constrained, confined. How does the state increase demand? Suppose the state spends a rupee, and suppose the state takes that rupee in the form of taxes from the working people, peasants and workers. Then there is no net increase in demand because the peasants and workers more or less use a very large part of this rupee on their consumption, as I was saying earlier. Therefore, their consumption goes down by a rupee, but the state expenditure goes up by a rupee, no increase, no net increase in aggregate demand. But on the other hand, there would be a net increase in aggregate demand if the state expenditure went up with nobody being taxed, which is what we call a fiscal deficit. If the state just ran a budget deficit, that it just increases expenditure, didn't tax anybody, and in fact borrowed from the central bank or borrowed from the banking system, then there is a net increase in demand. Alternatively, there would be a net increase in aggregate demand if the state actually taxed capitalists and the rich. Because if you tax the rich, as I mentioned, you take a rupee from them, their consumption may go down by half a rupee because they were consuming only half a rupee out of this 1 rupee. But on the other hand, state expenditure goes up by a rupee, therefore there's a net increase in aggregate demand. So the state intervention in aggregate demand, to enlarge aggregate demand, to keep overproduction under control, is something which can happen if state expenditure is financed either by a fiscal deficit or alternatively by taxing the rich. Now, if you tax the rich, then finance would flow out of your country. Therefore, no state of a country that is part of this globalization would actually be willing to tax the rich, to any greater extent. On the other hand, a fiscal deficit, what we call deficit financing, is something which also finance does not like. It would like the state to run a fiscal deficit for giving resources to itself, for giving resources to capitalists. But if the state enlarged its own expenditure and did it through a fiscal deficit, then that means that the capitalists are not necessary. That, if the state itself directly intervenes to enlarge employment, then the capitalists are not necessary, bypasses the capitalists, and this is something which finance does not like. Therefore, they do not like a fiscal deficit. They do not like taxation of the rich. By the way, this is one reason why most countries in the world, with the exception of the United States, even India, they actually have fiscal responsibility legislation, which basically means that your fiscal deficit cannot exceed more than 3% of your GDP. Earlier, under colonialism, under the gold standard, the governments had to balance their budgets. Now, they don't actually balance their budgets. What they do is to make sure that the fiscal deficit doesn't exceed 3% of the GDP. We actually have a law. Imagine, we don't have a law saying that everybody should get employment. We don't have a law saying that the government should have a minimum percentage of taxation from the rich. But we do have a law saying that fiscal deficit cannot be more than 3% of the central government, cannot be more than 3% of the GDP, and similarly, state government's fiscal deficit cannot be more than 3%. Therefore, the hands of the state are tied in managing aggregate demand. So on the one hand, under globalization, you have a tendency towards overproduction, crisis, generation of unemployment, generation of recession. In other words, it would tend to produce a recession. But on the other hand, the government that could actually overcome this, its hands are tied. Therefore, under the current neoliberal regime, a crisis is inevitable. A crisis of unemployment, a crisis of overproduction is absolutely inevitable. Now you may ask, but if it is inevitable, why didn't it appear earlier? Earlier, you see, the counteracting tendency to the crisis is not provided by government intervention, but it was provided by what is called asset price bubbles, particularly in economies like the US economy. The US in the 1990s had what is called a dot-com bubble. You suddenly found that the equities of dot-com companies started zooming on the stock market. When that bubble collapsed, then you had a new bubble coming up, which was the housing bubble. When the housing, you see what happens in the bubbles is that prices of these assets just rise enormously for speculative reasons. In other words, suppose prices are rising far beyond what the asset itself would normally cost. But the price rise continues because people speculate. They think that, look, this price is not going to come down today. It might come down day after tomorrow. So if I buy the asset today and sell it tomorrow, I would actually get a capital gain. I would actually get a speculative gain. So people, for speculative reasons, keep buying the asset, even though everybody knows that one day is going to collapse. But nonetheless, people keep buying, and the speculative bubble gives rise to an asset price bubble. And that in turn means that people feel they become wealthy. Suppose I actually have a house whose current market price because of the bubble is 10 million, while its construction would cost only quarter of a million. But the point is, with 10 million, I feel that I'm wealthy. I can sell it for 10 million tomorrow. And because of that, then I raise my consumption and so on. So the formation of asset price bubbles has a wealth effect on people, and that in turn can actually give rise to larger demand. So the tendency towards overproduction crisis, which is imminent in neoliberal globalization, was kept in check because of the formation of asset price bubbles in the United States in particular. These bubbles get formed everywhere. Even in India, you have an asset price bubble that gets formed because of the stock market boom. But the point is, very few people hold stock market equity. Their demand is very small. But in the United States, which is the world's biggest capitalist economy, large numbers of people are temporary beneficiaries of asset price bubbles, and that in turn had kept up the real demand until the bubble collapsed. Now, the point is, therefore, what you find is that, but of course, once a bubble collapses, next time it becomes more difficult because, after all, when the bubble has collapsed, then people will be more scared to hold the asset, more scared to speculate about it, speculate on the price of the asset, which is why no serious asset price bubble of the kind that the United States had experienced in the early part of this century, because of the housing bubble, a similar bubble has not been formed. Therefore, the tendency of even these bubbles, firstly, you cannot order a bubble. You cannot hold a gun to somebody's head and say speculate and buy the asset. You cannot order a bubble. But even if such a bubble could, in principle, get formed and provide an antidote to the overproduction crisis, it becomes more and more difficult. People become more and more scared about buying assets whose prices can collapse. The collapse of the housing bubble has actually now put the fear of God in the minds of many US wealth holders who really are now scared to speculate. Therefore, even the capacity of bubbles to provide an antidote keeps going down. The state no longer can play that role. And for all these reasons, world capitalism gets enmeshed deeper and deeper in a crisis. Now, you may say that, look, what are you talking about? In the US, Trump says unemployment has not been as low as it is today. Trump was talking, by today, I mean before the pandemic, Trump was talking about unemployment being only 3.5%. But as a matter of fact, what if you look at US data, what has happened is a very substantial decline in work participation rate. In other words, what is happening is a large number of people, when there are not enough jobs, they drop out of the workforce. And therefore, unemployment appears low, but on the other hand, is very high when you take into account the dropout. If you actually take the dropout into account and you calculate the US work participation rate, assume the same US work participation rate as had prevailed in 2008 before the collapse of the housing bubble. Suppose it prevails today, then the unemployment rate in the US would be in excess of 8%, which is quite substantial. In other countries, Europe is even higher. Now the unemployment rate, and I'm talking about before pandemic, is something which was in India, for instance, in 2019, the unemployment rate was higher than it had been at any time in the last 45 years. In other words, any time since 1973, when oil price shock took place and, of course, generated a certain amount of unemployment. So all over the world, there is world capitalism is now sinking into a serious crisis of overproduction, which is the result of neoliberal globalization. The pursuit of neoliberal policies cannot generate the kind of demand that world capitalism requires in order to stave off the crisis of unemployment and overproduction. Now, in this, therefore, something has to be done. How does capitalism survive? It cannot survive by simply being enmeshed in a crisis. Three possibilities exist before capitalism. Three possibilities are there before world capitalism. One is that, okay, I mentioned that if any country defies the will of finance, suppose a particular country decided that, look, we are going to tax the rich and the government spends that, finance would leave that country and go out. But on the other hand, suppose all the major capitalist countries in the world got together and decided on a policy of this kind, then finance can't go to the moon. It can't go to the Jupiter or Saturn. It will have to be here. So if all of them simultaneously decide, this is called a coordinated fiscal stimulus. If all of them simultaneously decided to give, by all I mean, let's say 20 major capitalist countries decide on a coordinated fiscal stimulus, then that could be a way in which they could revive the world economy. In other words, they would act as a proxy for a world state, because 20 major capitalist countries getting together to coordinate their fiscal policies, to have a coordinated fiscal stimulus, would actually mean that it's like a world state. Now, if the world state is actually taking over from, then the globalized finance can actually be controlled, not by individual nation state, but by the world state. But there is no talk about it. Nobody is even mentioning it. Trump, if anything, is now pursuing protectionist policies. In other words, Trump is withdrawing from globalization, and Trump's protectionist policies are a symptom of exactly what I'm saying, namely that neoliberal globalization has reached a dead end, because of which the United States president is actually pursuing a protectionist policies, and Trump's protectionism basically implies exporting unemployment. That basically that I protect my economy, I make sure that our workers get jobs. But on the other hand, I protect my economy by shutting out exports from China or shutting out exports from some other countries. That basically means unemployment gets generated there. So protectionism is an export of unemployment, and protectionism is something which individual countries can embark on, but then this basically implies that there is no coordination among the leading capitalist powers. So, coordinated fiscal policy is something which is out. Nobody is even talking about it. The second thing is that individual countries can pursue, like I mentioned, Trump is doing. Individual countries can actually drop out of this globalization because you see, Trump's policy of protecting the US economy can work only if other countries don't retaliate. Suppose it is the case that the Americans protect themselves against imports from China. Now, if the Chinese protect themselves against American goods, in that case, you would find that everywhere this, that people would be engaged in a struggle where each is keeping other countries' markets, other countries' goods out, and that, of course, would not only be the end of globalization, that within a capitalist setup is going to accentuate the crisis, because if you have trade wars between countries, then that would mean whatever little investment would have taken place would now not take place at all, because capitalists would be scared in the event of a trade war between countries what is going to happen. Therefore, one way in which countries can actually uh, uh, protect themselves against this crisis is by coming out of the phenomenon of globalization, using the state to, using the state for this purpose. But then that would also mean coming out of capitalism, because after all, as I mentioned, it is the hegemony of finance that is producing this crisis. Therefore, coming out of globalization would mean that you have to destroy the hegemony of finance. The moment any country tries to, suppose India tomorrow tries to introduce protectionist policies, then India's introducing protectionist policies would mean finance would try moving out, and therefore you have to control capital flows. If you control capital flows, then your local big capital as well as international capital would be against you. If they are against you, then you would have to rely on the support of the workers and peasants. And when you rely on their support to have a state that pursues these kinds of policies, then you will be moving out of the capitalist system altogether. Then you'll have to move towards socialism. Not immediately, but over a period of time. You have to be prepared to move towards socialism. So one, I mentioned the coordinated fiscal stimulus that is not on. The other is in fact delinking from globalization, but delinking from globalization cannot be done within the capitalist system all that easily. The third is, of course, that you do nothing. You remain within the capitalist system, you remain with the hegemony of globalized finance, but to the extent unemployment takes place, you fudge data if the to say that no, there's no unemployment. You suppress data, no unemployment. And if the unemployed march, if the unemployed actually create trouble, if the unemployed demonstrate, then you use a combination of two methods. One is repression, put them in jail. And the other is to distract their attention by building temples, by demonizing Muslims, and so on. Now, that exactly is the path which the Indian government is pursuing. India is not the only country. The Turkey is pursuing that, large numbers are going. Brazil is pursuing that, Turkey is pursuing that, Hungary is pursuing that, lots of Eastern European countries are pursuing that. And there's a very strong tendency towards that even in the advanced countries. AFD in Germany, Marine Le Pen in France, even Trump in the US is roughly of a very similar persuasion. But the point is that would be the authoritarian fascist direction, that you cannot control the crisis, but on the other hand, you actually control the people through a combination of repression and through a combination of repression and distracting them by demonizing the other. In other words, so that their anger is not against the system, but their anger is against the other. You don't have a job. Okay, why don't you have a job? Because that Mexican is taking away your job. You don't have a job because the Chinese is stealing your job. You don't have a job because the immigrants are taking away your job. That's the kind of narrative which is now being played out all across the world. And it is that narrative, which is an authoritarian fascist narrative, that is the third option. Now, therefore, you find that in different countries now, there is fiscal stimulus is not really being talked about, because this is something which, this was suggested even during the Great Depression of the 1930s. Some German trade unions had suggested this coordinated fiscal stimulus. Occasionally, you find some academics, some university people talking about the need for a coordinated fiscal stimulus, but nothing is happening on that score. All that the governments are doing within the regime of neoliberalism and neoliberal globalization is using monetary policy, not fiscal policy, not government expenditure, but by reducing the interest rate. Now, the interest rate is now in the United States is virtually zero. Both the short and long-term interest rates have been driven down to zero. Even then, the world crisis continues. What is more, you actually find now many people arguing that, look, this crisis is not going to be overcome. If you have zero interest rates, you have to have negative interest rates. What happens with the interest rate? That, if you can actually borrow from a bank, let's say 100 rupees, and you use these 100 rupees for undertaking investment, in that case, the interest rate you pay on your loan is negative. Therefore, even if your investment fetches you a zero rate of return, even then it becomes worth your while to do this. Therefore, the whole idea, many people are arguing, is to have negative interest rates. So deep is the structural crisis of capitalism that now people are talking in terms of negative interest rates. But of course, you cannot really have a European Central Bank also is now giving negative interest rates on certain kinds of loans, but it creates problems. You see, you cannot have negative interest rates in a cash economy. If a bank gives loans at negative interest rate, then the bank has to accept deposits at a negative interest rate. Now, in a cash economy, why should anybody deposit money in a bank if you get a negative interest rate in it? You may as well then hold the cash in your pockets. Therefore, the idea in a cash economy that you can have negative interest rates is really not very applicable. And that being the case, monetary policy is the only instrument that governments have in the regime of globalization. Monetary policy does not work. Fiscal policy is not allowed by the hegemony of finance. An alternative is to delink from globalization, and that would require a left turn to government policy making. While what most governments are now, large numbers of governments are doing, particularly in the third world, is actually to move towards authoritarian fascist regimes. Now, you see, there is a difference between current authoritarian fascism and what had prevailed in the 1930s. You may say that, look, in the 1930s, Japan had a kind of authoritarian fascist regime, but it got out of the depression, was the first country to get out of the depression. Germany under Hitler got out of the depression. The government borrowed money and spent on military expenditures in preparation, in 1933, in 1931 Japan, in 1933 Germany, they armed themselves in order to launch the Second World War. Therefore, that in that period, the authoritarian fascist regimes actually could generate employment because they borrowed money for larger government military spending. But that time, finance capital was not global. German government actually was facing German finance capital. Japanese government was facing actually Japanese finance capital. So there's no question of finance leaving your country and going elsewhere if you ran a fiscal deficit. Therefore, the capacity of the authoritarian fascist regimes, in particular nation states, today, even to generate employment through military spending and so on, is non-existent. Therefore, this authoritarian fascist route, which is what we are seeing in India, is something that is not going to bring an iota of improvement in the conditions of the people. On the contrary, what it would do is to worsen the crisis. Take India. What is happening in India? The government believes that if we are going to get out of the crisis, we are going to generate larger employment, then we should give incentives to the capitalists so that the capitalists invest more. If they invest more, demand is created, and if demand is created, more output and employment will be generated. Therefore, they are actually squeezing the workers and peasants in order to give more money to the capitalists. Now, imagine, I mentioned earlier that every rupee transferred from the workers and peasants to the capitalists reduces the level of demand in the economy. Therefore, the capitalists would happily pocket the money but not undertake any investment. Therefore, it is actually going to worsen the crisis of neoliberal globalization as countries like India face this crisis. And as things become worse, you would find that this authoritarian fascist regime would become even more repressive. And this is exactly what I fear can happen. Therefore, for countries like India, there are just two alternatives. One is that we have to, one is what is happening, that authoritarian fascist regime that demonizes Muslims, demonizes others, demonizes intellectuals, demonizes artists and so on, that suppresses freedom of expression so that there can be, that introduces fear, pervasive fear in society so that there can be no mobilization as far as the people are concerned, so that all mobilization leads to arrest and detention. The other is an alternative route that would begin by enlarging the government expenditure, finance this enlargement through wealth taxation, taxing the rich, and use that the proceeds of the wealth taxation for enlarging the welfare state expenditures and so on. But when this happens, then it is part of a journey away from capitalism towards socialism. Why do I say this? Suppose you do all this, then the capitalists would actually not be able to, not be willing to make much investment. Then the state has to come in to make more investment. And that being the case, increasingly, therefore, you would have the public sector growing in size. Increasingly, you would therefore have welfare expenditures growing in size and wealth taxation or income taxation on the very rich increasing in size. And that is a route that takes you away from capitalism. All this has to be sustained through capital controls, through controlling movements of finance into your and out of your country. The moment you do that, then the Americans are going to put sanctions against you, and therefore you'll have to have trade controls and so on. So that's a completely different route that we'll have to take. So currently, the choice before countries like India, many third world economies, is either to move in the direction of a welfare state leading on to socialism, or to move in the direction of authoritarian fascism. Thank you very much for your patience. Thank you for listening.
Since the COVID has proved that the capitalist structure looks just fancy from outside, if we see what has happened in the United States as well as in the Cuba, do you think the time has come for these capitalist countries to start focusing on welfare policies as well as socialistic policies?
If you do that, then there would no longer be capitalist countries. In other words, you see, there is a logic of capitalism. As I have been talking about, that as a matter of fact, the contradiction I mentioned between, let's look at it carefully. The contradiction I mentioned between the hegemony of globalized finance and the pursuit of policies by the nation state. The state has to pursue policies that globalized finance likes. Now, that excludes not only state intervention in demand management, that also excludes welfare policies, because of the fact that if the state is going to pursue welfare policies, and of course to pursue welfare policy you have to tax the rich, then this is something which finance does not like. That's why they would like a privatization of healthcare, a privatization of education. Why do you think social democracy is facing a crisis all over the world? Because social democracy in Europe had introduced these policies of larger government healthcare. The National Health Service in Britain was introduced by the Labour government. Similarly, in the Scandinavian countries. But the point is that to the extent social democracy caves in, obeys the dictates of international finance capital, of globalized finance, social democracy betrays its own class roots, because after all, it's a working class tendency. And that being the case, it over time gets slowly and slowly wiped out. There's no difference between Tony Blair and the Tory party. And that is why the Labour Party would not come into power as long as the Conservatives are there, because of course, big business, the capitalists would prefer the Conservatives to a Labour Party led by Tony Blair. The only alternative is a Labour Party that is actually led by someone else, who would actually take a left-wing course. Why is it that in the United States, for instance, Bernie Sanders really got so much support? Bernie Sanders got the support because he was suggesting a left-wing course. It's another thing that the Democratic Party's establishment did not want Bernie Sanders, and therefore he dropped out. But in fact, if instead of Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders had fought Trump in the last election, he might have won, because he got enormous amounts of working class support. So the point is that now the choice is really between a movement towards welfare state that may take you towards socialism and, of course, authoritarian management, at least in third world countries like ours.
Next question is regarding the impact neoliberalism is having on our environment, which is not very much talked about. Also, we would like to know about your take on the environment assessment that was released in 2020.
I mentioned that the Indian government's strategy for overcoming the crisis is to say give concessions to capital. You see, there's a very simple fallacy in this thinking, that if demand is not growing, if market is not growing, then no capitalist is going to make investments. Okay, no capitalist is going to make investment. Therefore, simply giving them more concessions is not going to give rise to larger investment if the market is not growing. But the Indian government thinks differently. The Indian government thinks that if you give concessions to the capitalists, then they are going to invest more. Now, as a result, as you know, rights of labor are being taken away. In fact, only now they are introducing a bill in the place of the ordinance they had, where in all the establishments employing more than 300 workers, where there was some protection against sacking, protection for workers, that protection is going to go. Similarly, environmental impact assessment is now virtually being given up in the name of investment, which basically means that you can do any project anywhere, even if it damages the environment, without uh, the law coming in your way. And it also means giving concessions to capital in the form of subsidies and so on. So the point is that this is something which does ecological damage. It it does damage by shrinking the market, because you're taxing the workers to subsidize capitalists. It accentuates the crisis. It does ecological damage. And this is no way to resolve. And to the extent people are angry about it, then you follow this business of communal polarization, and you follow this business about putting people in jail, etc. So this is the authoritarian fascist way that I was talking about, which many countries, including India, are following now.
This question is about the trade unionism, the relevance of trade unionism in the current world. So, what we can see is that the relevance of unionizing labor has been reduced over the last few decades. And the reasons could be many. I think one of the reasons is maybe the computerization, the emergence of knowledge workers, where they feel proud. They feel proud of being part of a company. They feel some kind of entitlement, some kind of ownership about the company. And this is also, what people used to say is that the neoliberalism is not just a economic project; it's also a cultural project where it makes people feel that you are something. You are like everything is at your fingertip, but at the same time, it is not the case. Uh, but at the same time, we also know that the employees have been suffering in this decade. I mean, they are the people, as you said, the median wage of American worker has been almost same as they used to get in 1970s. And that irony is still there, but people are afraid to kind of moving to a labor union kind of thing. So my question is that how left or any progressive party can address this issue, this irony between there is a real suffering, but at the same time they are not willing to come together and make a demand kind of thing.
No, I think that's a very important question. I think a very important reason why trade unions are actually now greatly weakened is, apart from what you mentioned about the IT revolution, very important reason is neoliberalism. Because now capital is mobile across the world. That any trade union in the United States or Britain is is in no position to defend the workers, because then capital can move to some cheap third world country. Okay, now there are a number of reasons why trade unions are at a kind of disadvantage. One, of course, is that unionization is much greater in the public sector than in the private sector, everywhere, all across the world. In the United States, one third of the public sector workers, roughly one third, which of course includes education, that means, colleges, one third of public sector workers are unionized. The proportion of workers unionized in the private sector is just 7%. Therefore, privatization, which is a part of neoliberalism, also weakens the trade unions. So the mobility of capital to cheaper destinations, the privatization of the public sector or the government sector, all these are also very important factors apart from what you mentioned. And the point is, let's be very clear about one thing, that one of the reasons why this crisis is so serious is because it's not easy to get out of it. Suppose it is, I mentioned that the way out of the crisis would be, in the absence of a globally coordinated fiscal stimulus, would be for individual countries to actually de-link from globalization. What does that mean? That basically means that you pursue. Suppose tomorrow in India, uh, a progressive government came to power. The progressive government would immediately start putting money in people's hands, would enlarge MDNREGS, would actually enlarge transfers to the poor, to the workers, and so on, to the peasants. And this would mean that it will have to go for a fiscal deficit or for wealth taxation, taxing wealth. When that happens, finance would move out of the country, to prevent which you will then have to have capital control. You prevent finance from going out, which already means delinking from globalization, because globalization means free movements of finance across country borders. So you will have to then delink from globalization by putting capital control. When you put capital control, then you would not be able to, you prevent finance from going out, but you would not actually get sufficient finance to be able to finance your trade deficit. Okay, because we are a country where imports are much larger than our exports. And this gap is made up through the inflow of finance. Now, if finance does not go out, it would not even come in. If it doesn't come in, you can't make trade deficit. Therefore, you will have to have control over imports. When you have control over imports, immediately the amount of goods which are available to a country shrink. And what is more, the Americans are then going to put sanctions against you, which other capitalist countries would also follow, as they are doing vis-a-vis Venezuela. So once that happens, then the availability of goods goes down. And when the availability of goods goes down, the people who suffer the most are precisely the people for whom all this is happening, namely the workers, the peasants, the ordinary working people. They are hit hard. So the transition from where we are to a new path of development is going to be very difficult. This transition is going to hurt the very people for whom the new path of development is important. We can at the most hope that the pains of transition are minimized, but they are going to be pains of transition, which is why it's very important for the people to be clear that these pains are there, so we don't make false promises. Okay, people have to be with this new trajectory, with this new path, and that is something which is very important. The importance of education in telling people what exactly are the issues is extremely important. Authoritarian fascism actually diseducates people. But on the other hand, the left has to actually educate people and tell them what all is involved, not make tall promises.
How can you say actually the left economy that actually still based centered on Marx or Keynes can actually answer the new age issues depending on the economy? Also, there is a thought of democratization of economy is still there, and that such thoughts, how you see such thoughts?
Firstly, throughout my talk, I did not take any names. Okay, I did not talk of Marx. I did not talk of Lenin. I did not talk of etc. Let us forget all names. Let us forget everything. In other words, if we are going to look at the world today, let's just look at the world. In this world, there is a certain neoliberal regime. Okay, neoliberal is only an adjective. It's not a name, is it? Okay, there's a certain neoliberal regime. That neoliberal regime, for reasons which I explained, is not going to work anymore. Okay, it has a deep internal contradiction, namely it increases inequalities. When it increases inequality, mind you, even when countries like India, China, and so on have grown very rapidly, inequalities inside these countries has also increased very rapidly. Let's keep China out of here because China is a more complex case. It is not a pure and simple case of neoliberal capitalism. But say in India, during the period that the country was having 7 to 8% growth rate, I'm not talking about now. During the period, the country was having 7 to 8% growth rate. In fact, not only was there a substantial increase in inequality, but the absolute amount of consumption of ordinary people was going down. Let me give you just one figure which the BJP government has actually suppressed. If you look at per capita rural expenditure in real terms, in 2017-18, according to the National Sample Survey, compare it to the per capita rural, per capita, not just for the poor, per capita rural real expenditure in 2011-12, you find that in 17-18 it was 9% lower. The average real expenditure 9% lower. So neoliberalism and all this was long before, 17-18 I'm talking about, long before all this COVID-19 and so on. So neoliberalism is one which has actually so greatly accentuated inequalities that even in countries like India experiencing high growth rates, dramatically high growth rates, you actually find people becoming absolutely worse. Now, of course, because of the crisis, they'll become even more worse. Okay? And this is the only way that such a neoliberalism, therefore, can be sustained, or a neoliberal regime can be sustained in today's world, is by suppressing the people. Because after all, you have nothing to offer. The only way you can actually do that is by suppressing the people and by diverting their attention through demonization of the other. The other may be a religious minority, the other may be immigrants, ethnic, and so on. Okay, so this is where neoliberalism has brought. Neoliberalism today and pursuit of neoliberalism is necessarily accompanied by authoritarian fascism. Okay. Now, against this, I'm saying that the only way that you can have this is by increasing the purchasing power in the hands of the people. And let that be done by the government putting money, either through directly its expenditures or through its transfers to the people. And how do you finance it? By taxing the rich, by taxing the wealthy. The moment you do that, then the neoliberal regime becomes difficult to sustain because, as I said, there would be outflow of finance, there would be sanctions against you, there would be trade deficit which is unmanageable and so on. Therefore, one thing would lead to another, and the inevitable course, therefore, would be to delink even further and further and further from neoliberal globalization, from the kind of globalization we have been having. Now, it seems to me that that is unavoidable, that's inevitable. And if that is the case, then of course there'll be transitional pains, but ultimately it is something which would actually take us. It will have to be based on the support of workers and peasants. Obviously, the Ambanis and the Adanis are not going to support such a policy. It will have to be based on the support of workers and peasants, solid support of workers and peasants. Therefore, it has to benefit the workers and peasants, and that is something that would enlarge the home market, etc. Now, if you pursue that, there will be, as I said, there will be transitional pains, but it seems to me that the only way to get out of the crisis. I have not mentioned Marx or Lenin or anybody. It is, let's think for ourselves. This is the only way that we can get out of it. Okay.
What, according to you, are some of the flaws in state-led capitalism, like that of China? And what solutions do you propose? And will those solutions be neoliberal?
No. I mean, I'm not calling China a capitalist country, not at all. I mean, I think China is a much more complex case because China is coming from a background of the Chinese Revolution. In other words, even though capitalists operate in China, it doesn't mean China is a capitalist country. There's a substantial public sector, and in China there's also an acute awareness of many of the issues I'm talking about. For instance, I'll give you an example. When neoliberalism, okay, one of the features of a neoliberal economy, which you find in India, is that it invariably attacks petty production, including peasant production, that we have found in India. Okay, it attacks the peasant production. It attacks the fishermen, the handloom weavers, the craft producers, the kind of etc. The entire spectrum of traditional petty production is something which is decimated by neoliberalism. Okay. GST or demonetization, of course, was not neoliberalism. That was Modi's own stupidity. But on the other hand, you look at GST. GST has basically increased the tax load on these people. And therefore, in India today, a very important phenomenon is the immense crisis of the petty production sector. Now, in China, again, there was a similar squeeze on the peasantry, and so on. The Chinese Communist Party adopted a slogan towards a socialist countryside, where they tried to put some more money in the rural areas to improve the condition of peasants. So, which way China is going to go? And inside China, again, I'm sure there'll be debates about which way to go. Precisely the debate I'm talking about would be occurring in China. So, which way China is going to go is something that I'm not speculating about. But about capitalist third world countries, I am more clear. I'm more certain. Okay, and in capitalist third world countries, obviously, either you move towards greater authoritarian fascism or you move towards, through undoubtedly painful transitional difficulties, towards greater and greater welfare state financed at the expense of the rich, which necessarily then would invite hostility from capital, including hostility from world capitalism, and that would therefore force you to move in a socialist direction. That's what I'm saying.
Left always has this problem of, we are fighting with a systemic issue, which is an abstraction, which is not a real thing that we can see. But and that's the reason, like, right wing always hijack this issue and narrate this issue and put it in a different way and make advantage of that. So how progressive politics or left can deal such an issue in a better way?
The fact that we trace the crisis to its systemic origins is not because of our imagination. I mean, it's a fact. It's a fact. In other words, if the right, which actually says that the immigrants are a problem or the Chinese are a problem and so on and so forth, could actually overcome the crisis, then obviously they would be able to keep holding the support of the people. Trump came to power. Okay, let's just distinguish between there is the middle, consisting of substantial sections of right-wing social democracy as well as the kind of liberal bourgeois parties. Okay, who deny the crisis. In other words, Hillary Clinton was not even concerned very much about unemployment until she was forced to. Now, it is certainly true that the left talks about unemployment and the right, not in India, the Indian right is much more right, but left talked about unemployment and Trump talked about unemployment. Okay, Trump actually talked about unemployment of the American workers, which Hillary Clinton originally was not talking about. Now, but on the other hand, the left, Bernie Sanders, who talked about unemployment, did get substantial amount of support. So it's not the case that when the left takes up people's issues and relates it to their systemic origins, that it does not get support. Okay, so the task before the left is not to be hegemonized by these liberal bourgeois kind of, and right social democratic ideas about globalization being a good thing and so on and so forth, but to actually put before the people the real systemic crisis of capitalism, okay, and to give them an alternative. Now, and also to warn them that, look, if this alternative is there, you are going to face transitional problem because of imperialism, because Americans are going to kind of come in the way, etc. So I think it's, if anything, you look at the recent. Okay, let's look at Britain, for instance. You had the British Labour Party leader, who was actually very left-wing. But unfortunately, on the Brexit, what he did is that he actually went along with this anti-Brexit lobby, which was not his own belief. He should have presented before the people an alternative agenda that, okay, let us get out of the common market, and this is what we're going to do. Now the point is that, that Boris Johnson does not have an alternative agenda. He only has an agenda of getting out of Brexit. But if it is the case that actually you had an alternative agenda before the working class, then the working class would actually have, uh, much more solidly and overwhelmingly voted for the left candidate. So it seems to me that whenever the left has honestly put forward its position about the systemic crisis of capitalism that capitalism is facing today and the hardships before the people, it has actually garnered support among them. It's not the case that it has not. I mean, that's my feeling.
We have a new educational policy coming up where we are aligned towards encouraging our youth towards more vocational oriented subjects, arts and crafts subjects, etc. And on the other hand, we also have this social inclusional policies where the certain marginalized sections of the society is also being encouraged to be a part of the economy by initiatives like Jan Dhan Yojana, etc. So how does this contribute to the optimism side of what we are saying? Are we aligned? Are we prepared with the right policies from the side of the Indian government in case we are tending to be favoring more of socialistic policies and worker-oriented policies?
This new education policy is in fact a step backwards. The new education vocation, you see, the new education policy, it does not talk at all about reservations. It doesn't talk at all about reservations. The new education policy talks about privatization of education. Now, if you privatize education, then it becomes more expensive. When it becomes more expensive, then automatically large numbers of people are excluded. Ordinary people, people who come from socially and economically deprived backgrounds, they get excluded from it. It does not even talk about scholarships. It talks about those colleges and universities which charge fees, giving scholarships to people. Now, the point is that they are not going to give scholarships unless it is the case that you have reservations. But it does not talk about reservations. Therefore, it actually excludes large number of people. And what is more, all this vocational training and so on are actually ways of hiding that exclusion. Okay, you don't want a Dalit child to actually do a BA or an MA. So you say, okay, after class 8, he will go and do vocational training, or he'll go and do open learning system. So this open learning, vocational training is important, but only after a certain minimum level of academic education. After a minimum level of academic education, somebody wants to go for vocational training, very good. But on the other hand, if you push people into vocational training, they are now going to have board exams after class 3, after class 5, after class 8. In that case, effectively, you are actually shunting people off from a very young age towards vocational training, towards open learning systems and so on, all of which are denying them an academic education. Therefore, this is actually an exclusionary policy rather than a policy of including more and more people in this. Okay. And while that is happening on the one side, on the other side, they are talking about, making you proud as an Indian, the glories of ancient India. But listen, this caste system. Now, if you talk about glories of ancient India, are you going to include untouchability as a glory of ancient India? Of course not. That means basically you don't tell them about untouchability. You basically, prettify our past. Make sure that they don't learn the kind of obnoxious, horrible kind of, oppressiveness of the Indian society. Students have to be told the truth and not kind of told a prettified picture of our ancient past. So the education policy I consider to be a step backwards.
And my second part was about the economic inclusion policies. So how well is it working according to you?
You know, at this moment, unemployment is going to reach at the end of this year anything between 50 million to 100 million. So what inclusion can one talk about? You know, inclusion implies that you must have a strategy for generating jobs and so on, which the government doesn't have. So you can say anything, but fundamentally, okay, I'll give you one very concrete example. Everywhere, including the United States, during the lockdown that Trump ordered, some money was handed over to everybody. Everybody, okay? Some amount of money was handed over to everybody. India must be the only country in the world that did nothing of the sort. No money was handed over to everybody. We demanded, you know, everybody demanded. The left demanded, innumerable civil society organizations demanded, give 7,000 rupees per month to every household during the period of lockdown for at least a period of 3 months. Okay, 3 to 6 months you give, at least for 3 months you give 7,000 rupees per month to every household. The government did nothing. Nothing. In other words, to this day, people have not got a penny. I mean, they did it for some small kind of, select kind of groups, and it's not clear how much they have got, and certainly not 7,000 rupees a month, some 500 rupees a month